Hello, my fellow world leader classmates. I hope you're all doing well and surviving out there. I decided to make this video to share with you guys my findings on the amazing and talented Hrosvitha. I apologize in advance if I get any of these terms wrong. Unfortunately, I'm not an expert in German or Latin or anything of the sort. So yeah, this is my presentation. So Hrosvitha was a German nun and a playwright and a historian. Her name actually means a couple of different things. The literary meaning of her name is said to be strong honor, but she actually translates it to be more along the lines of loud cry or strong voice. And this translation actually fits well because Hrosvitha was actually very much a voice for women, and I think her work really shows this refusal to give in to a sort of male oppression. But we're gonna look at that more in detail a little bit later in the video. So something interesting and kind of iconic about Hrosvitha is that she's actually considered the earliest German female poet and the first ever female dramatist in Europe, which is super cool. Hrosvitha, you go girl. She's gold. What I also found was that it was hard to actually find information on Hrosvitha because records weren't really kept that great during this medieval period. Remember, this medieval period is like during the time when they went through like the dark plague and like all these kinds of things. So I don't blame them for not having the best records on every single person. So I forgive them for that. But what we can tell through like her plays and stuff is that she had an amazing education. It's very clear that she was very educated because she's able to use like a meter style that's similar to Terence. If you guys don't remember, he was a Roman comedy playwright. That's kind of similar to Plautus, which we know that she also read Plautus, but she's able to make Terence's style more of her own. So apart from reading contemporary work, she was also very, very well read with biblical scripture in particular. So she was born in Saxony, somewhere around the 10th century, and this place is so beautiful. I mean, look at these pictures. These pictures are obviously an example of the tourist gaze, but still I would definitely want to visit because this place, it literally looks like it's straight out of Lord of the Rings. It is so cool. Anyway, back to Hrosvitha. We don't know a lot about her childhood, but many believe, and I kind of agree with them, that she was of noble birth because only novices from noble families were chosen to enter the monasteries of her time. So Hrosvitha was very most likely of noble birth, and she may have entered the abbey at a very young age. Because of her skill in Latin, this kind of indicates that she had many years of training in the language because she's so good at it that you kind of just assumed that she had been, doing it for a long time. So, and it is known that some young women would make the decision to pursue a religious life like this as young as 12 years old. So she also may have learned Greek because she often used Greek sources in her stories, and her sister also had studied Greek. So Otto the Great, or Otto the First, he's a descendant of Ludolf. He ruled Germany during Hrosvitha's time. This guy was a huge deal during this time. He did so much for the Roman kind of empire, I believe. So the monasteries of Saxony, they were considered free abbeys, meaning that even in the convents of the abbesses were responsible to the king and not the church. But this changed in 947 when Otto I freed the Gandersheim Abbey from royal rule, giving the abbess complete authority over them. So contrary to later restrictions on women, she had her own court of law, coined her own money, and had a seat in the imperial diet. And she even sent soldiers to battle. So she was directly responsible for the nuns and the canonesses in the abbey. So she actually became a super powerful woman at her time, which is really admirable because it's so uncommon to see. So that is really, really cool. So she joined the Benedictine convent of Gandersheim in Lower Saxony as a canoness. So a canoness, if you don't know, is kind of like a fancy nun. Hrosvitha's writings indicate a wide knowledge of both classical and religious literature. So this suggests that Gandersheim had this generous and large collection of manuscripts and a first-rate library. By her own admission, she was able to obtain all of her information from the convent's library. She also had some personal accounts of contemporary events from like guests and friends that she was able to get her hands on as well. So her writings indicate a familiarity with scholastic philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, music, and works such as Virgil, Terence, Ovid. Boethius, just so much. But she had access to a lot of different ways to gain knowledge, which is really cool. And she definitely took advantage of that. She became so smart and so powerful. So amazing. She's just amazing. The office of canoness first appeared in the 8th century and included vows of chastity and obedience, but not the vow of poverty as taken by the nuns usually. So these canonesses, they were nuns, but think about them as more like high-class nuns. Although they followed the rule of Saint Benedict, including communal living and daily recitation of the divine office, they had more freedom than the nuns. So they could receive guests, they could own books and property, they could have servants, they could enter and leave the monastery with permission. They had just so much access to a lot more. So they're kind of like, I like to call it like a high-class nun. So that's what Hrosvitha did. Hrosvitha produced a series of writings in 3 different genres, and all of them are in Latin. So during the 10th centuries, this was the only language that was used to write literary composition. So her plays, this means that her plays were definitely aimed towards a higher class, because if you think about it, common people didn't really have access to that type of education where they were able to learn Latin. So her plays were written in Latin, which is normally going to be read by more higher class people. So yeah. In addition to her 2 chronicles on the Gesta Otonis and Primordia Conobi Gandershemensis, sorry, that's so difficult to say. She wrote 8 epic poems and 6 dramas based on biblical stories and legends, saints, martyrs, etc. The themes for her works are conversion, chastity, faithfulness to Christ, even unto martyrdom. So most of her writings are themselves a conversion of pagan forms and vices into more Christian literature extolling virtues, and she often demonstrated how feminine faithfulness could defeat a male right. This is the feministic view coming into play, like I kind of mentioned in the beginning. But what's really interesting about Hrosvitha's way of doing things, a way of putting in that feministic point, is that she uses only like female protagonists who are virgins, and the oppressors in her plays, she makes it men. So she makes it men who like want to rob them of these, their virtue and etc. And so she, by having her female protagonist come out on top and come out victorious despite there being like a male oppressor, this really shows that feministic viewpoint. Although during her time, this was more just seen as a religious play. It wasn't seen like, it's feministic or it's doing this and that. No, it was more focused on the religious aspect behind it. So that's why these were so well accepted and people really liked them, men, including everybody, because even though it did have this like feministic view, it was overpowered by Hrosvitha being like, no, this is Christian, this is more religious work. So that's really interesting to me, how she kind of like slid that in and was very clever about the way that she wrote and stuff. So she often demonstrated how feminine faithfulness could defeat a male might. And this is something we see in her most known work called Dulcidius, which is a play about 3 virgins who refuse to deny their God and marry. So instead of this, they're killed, but their souls are saved. So it's actually a huge win for them, and they are victorious in the end. I'm gonna let Crash Course give you a quick overview of the play.
Take us there, Thought Bubble. Emperor Diocletian wants to arrange marriages for 3 virgin sisters. Agape, whose name means love, Irene, whose name means peace, and Kaiania, whose name means snow, which basically means purity. Diocletian tells the sisters they have to renounce Christianity. They don't wanna. So he locks them up, and he sends Dulcitius to question them. Dulcitius sees them through a window, decides they're all super hot, and asks them to be locked up in the kitchen so that he can, visit them. Why he needed to assault them in a kitchen specifically, unclear. The sisters, understandably, don't want to be perved on by Dulcitius, so they pray. And their prayers work. When Dulcitius enters the kitchen, he thinks that the pots and the pans are the sisters, so he starts hugging and kissing them, which covers him in soot. When he leaves, the soldiers see his blackened face and think he's a demon, and so do the people at the palace. And I mean, in a sense, they're not wrong. He gets the snot beat out of him. Dulcitius, fuming, he orders the sisters be stripped. but their clothes stick to them. Diocletian sends the torturer Sicinius, who orders Agape and Kaiania to be burned at the stake. They die, though miraculously their clothes and bodies are left intact. Sicinius then orders Irene, the youngest, to convert. She won't, so he tells the soldiers to take her to a brothel. Instead, she's miraculously spirited away to a mountaintop. Sicinius orders the soldiers to shoot her with arrows, and she dies. But she dies secure in her chastity and her faith.
So as you can tell, it has a ton of religious themes. Plus, it was really funny. Hrosvitha was a comedian, and she used this because she found that comedy, like Plautus's comedy and Terence's comedy, it was a bit too raunchy for her taste, which is understandable because, again, she's a nun. Hrosvitha was afraid that people would go down a rabbit hole with comedy like Plautus, and she was afraid that that type of comedy would lead people to damnation and to sinning and to all these other stuff. So she began writing her style of comedy in order to kind of stray people away from that. She wanted it to be more of like a healthy, like a good comedy, and not like this sort of raunchy Plautus type of comedy, which is a good method. It actually led it to become sacred comedy, it's known, or in Latin it's commedia sacrae, something like that. I'll have it written down so you guys can see it. One of them. So interestingly enough, her work is an example of a closet drama, which are plays that are more often read aloud or read in general since they were performed. So Hrosvitha seems to write them more in a way where they are meant to be read instead of performed. Through her prefaces, it's clear that Hrosvitha was commissioned by her abbess, Gerberga Otto II, and other virtuous and learned men, sharing her manuscripts with them. However, her works seem to have had little influence beyond Jandersheim, where they were probably read aloud by the nuns, and they might have even been performed at the convent or even at the court of Otto II. They probably most likely also served in educating the nuns. So after 5 centuries of kind of not getting any attention, her plays were discovered in 1493 by the German humanist Conrad Celtis in the Benedictine monastery at St. Emmeram at Regensburg. After editing by him, they were published in 1501 at Nuremberg. Subsequent editions were published in 1707 at Wittenberg, a French translation in 1847 in Paris, a German translation at Lubeck in 1857, and many more translations have been made since. Modern performances of her plays began with marionette performances in 1888 at Paris and continued to the professional stages of London and New York. In the crash course, they actually also mentioned something interesting that was the Guerrilla Girls. We learned about them in visual rhetoric. They actually also held like a competition or contest to see if anyone wanted to, instead of performing a play about a male playwright, they would perform Hrosvitha's play instead, which people actually did. So that was super interesting and cool too, kind of a fun fact to throw out there. In addition to being the first known dramatist of Christianity, Hrosvitha was also the earliest known historian of Germany, and her chronicles have been all of considered valuable to modern historians. Her works reveal the breadth of knowledge in early medieval monasteries, including musical theory, astronomical knowledge, number theory, classical theory, philosophy. There's just so much that Hrosvitha gives and is able to show in her work. And a lot of historians really love and respect her for that, because she mentions so much in her plays that she didn't have to, but it also like really helps us learn more about her time period. So this is an example of liturgical drama, which is medieval drama that is mostly religious, with most of the drama of the period being presented in the sanctuaries of churches, cathedrals, mostly presented in monasteries, but as urban centers started to emerge, services incorporating the small dramas of the tropes were produced in churches and cathedrals. So by the 13th century, dramas would be presented in languages spoken by ordinary people. So it wasn't until the 13th centuries when ordinary people were able to get a piece of the pie as well. So also an example of vernacular drama, religious vernacular drama. There's 3 different forms of these dramas. There's cycle, there's miracle, and there's morality. Hrosvitha in particular wrote more along the lines of morality, although some of her other ones could probably be in a different one or a combination of them. But specifically, morality plays were attempts to teach a moral lesson through the use of allegorical characters. So if you guys remember, in her play, she had different names for them. So one being snow, which meant purity, another, all these different kinds of symbols that her characters portrayed. And this definitely shows that it was a morality type of play, because the characters also often undertake a journey which they learn the moral lesson from, and also called station dramas because during the journey, the protagonist is confronted by a series of crises that can be seen as analogious to Christ's journey through the stations of the cross. So main characters are ordinary men and women rather than saints or biblical figures, which we do see in Hrosvitha's plays. Frequently, the base of these dramas is the struggle between two forces, one good and the other evil, for the soul of the main characters. This is a huge theme in Hrosvitha's plays. We see it all the time. This salvation and the saving of souls in particular. So that's just her sort of thing. And we're going to see more of these different types of plays in Everyman and some themes coming up in that. So I'm really excited about that. But yeah, I'm going to go ahead and end my presentation there. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you guys liked my presentation, and I'll see you guys later. Bye!